And Meredith, you're on.
Sounds great. This is my first time presenting by Zoom, so if there's any problems, please let me know. I'm going to turn off my personal video just to probably try to help the internet. I'm already getting a notice my internet connection is unstable, so hopefully it behaves. But I'll go ahead and share my presentation screen here. Hopefully everyone can see that good. And like I said, I've got a couple monitors set up so I can see Allie and she can wave at me if there's a problem. I'll try to keep an eye on her and on the chat. Feel free to ask questions throughout. And if it's a good time to pause, I don't want to take up all of your lunch, but as I tell people, I can talk about soils all day. So I might have trouble keeping the time down, but we'll give it a go.
So I am not able to see your presentation right now. I'm not sure if other folks are able to.
They can't. Okay, it looks like it was there. Oh, I had to click another button. How about now?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, so Amy Overstreet first asked me to do a presentation in coordination with World Soil Day, which is on Saturday. Here it's December 5th, right? I believe is Saturday. And I'm going to talk about that. So we're going to celebrate some of the soils in Vermont with World Soil Day and a little bit on what they are, how we study them, and then some soil health and how we promote it, since these are the big hot topics in soils these days. So brief outline, what is World Soil Day? What is soil, how we study it? What is soil health and how we promote it? So what is World Soil Day? It's held annually on December 5th, and it's designated by the United Nations. The very first one was in 2014, and it corresponds with the official birthday of the now former King of Thailand, who since passed away, I believe. Because he was such a big advocate and promoter of recognizing and the importance of soil and advocating for it, that they decided to have this annual event on his official birthday. So how cool is that? I want to be somebody that when they want to celebrate my birthday, it's like an international, celebration and recognition. There's a lot of information and materials. This is the official logo. You can find at the FAO.org website. Some past World Soil Days. So these are some of the logos from World Soil Days gone by. 2015 was actually designated the International Year of Soils. You guys may have remembered a lot of PR about that one. We had a Smithsonian exhibit in DC all about soils, focusing on different aspects. Being the solution to soil pollution was 2008, and focusing on stopping erosion, that was last year's. And this is the logo for this year. It's World Soil Day, keep soil alive and protect soil biodiversity. So that's another reason why I wanted to make sure to cover some soil health aspects on this presentation. But what is soil? I like this definition. Soil is the living, breathing skin of the earth that provides our food, clothing, shelter, filters our water, recycles our waste, supports our structures, and basically allows us to exist, survive, and thrive in this world. And that was the answer to an exam question on probably just about every Soil 101 class people ever take in college, because it's such an essential part of our lives that you can't just distill it into some simple mineral biological equation. But a lot of you have probably seen a diagram like this, and this is part of that information materials from that FAO website for World Soil Day. What is soil made of? About 45% minerals in an idealized soil system, 25% water, 25% air. Those fluctuate in the soil pore space, and maybe 5% organic matter. Personally, I hate these diagrams. I mean, they're good for educational purposes, getting you oriented to the nuts and bolts of the soil. But when I think of soil, I do not think of this diagram. I think of one like this. I think of soil as something that is formed, that is created. that we have these 4 soil forming processes: additions, losses, translocations, and transformations. Stuff that gets added to the soil, whether it's organic matter, stuff that's leached out, where it's eroded away, it might be a loss. Translocations, how things move through the soil profile. Maybe they start at the top, but then they end up translocating within that profile down below. And transformations, clay minerals are actually formed in soil based on dissolution of those minerals and reprecipitation out. And then there's the 5 soil forming factors: paramaterial, topography, climate, organisms, and time. If you don't know anything else about soil, but you know these 5 soil forming factors, you can really start to identify a lot of how the landscape is behaving just based on how those factors are varying wherever you are. And that's been something that's really been crucial for me in my career as I've moved around different parts of the country. Wherever I go, I may not have the soil series memorized. I may not have a lot of personal experience with exactly what I'm standing on at the moment, but I can look around and start identifying those 5 soil forming factors and start putting together a puzzle that's telling me how the soils are behaving in this landscape. So let's go over some of the factors in Vermont, right? Our climate is wet and it's pretty cold, and it's not the coldest places on Earth or the wettest places on Earth, but relatively speaking, the increased moisture really promotes a lot of vegetation growth. It also promotes leaching. So those are some of those additions, losses, processes that are forming soils. It's cold. We have shorter growing seasons. It also slows down decomposition, and it slows down chemical transformations and processes. So combining these two together, it's something that promotes organic matter accumulation, but it also kind of slows down some aspects of soil development. Organisms, that's another one. What do people think of in Vermont? They think of the snow, they think of the trees and the foliage in the fall. So the organisms that are growing in the soil are affecting how that soil develops and what those soil properties are. We have a lot of forest vegetation that results in a fungal dominated soil biology. And historically, there's been a lack of earthworms because earthworms couldn't really survive during the glaciation. So what we end up seeing from that is a concentration of a lot of organic matter on the very surface of the soil. We actually have organic soil layers that build up over time. We see some really strong aggregates in our surface soil material from all of that organic matter and that fungal dominated soil biology. And then we'll see some leached subsurface horizons. So underneath where all that organic matter is sitting right on top, we see some bleached, lighter colored soils where everything has been flushed out because of the precipitation funneling down along trees and tree roots, and then also acidic vegetation. When that organic matter breaks down into acidic things, it leaches the minerals out of the soil a lot easier. Parent material. Now this is a tricky one for people to wrap their heads around at first, but that's kind of what are we starting with when we're starting with the soil. And I made this map, and it's hard to do because in our soil survey data, we don't have parent material easily or consistently identified. So this is just kind of a general overview of what some of the parent materials in Vermont are. We have, predominantly 3 types. We have ones that have been transported by water. We have ones that are predominantly organics that have built up over time. And then we've got till, basically glacial till, which is something that's been transported by a big block of ice. Not after it melts. After it melts, then we have glacial, fluvial, lacustrine, and marine deposits. So those are actually that meltwater transporting things is going to be very different than the till itself. The till is just what happens when a bulldozer basically dumps a big pile of soil. Everything is mixed together. But once you start to get meltwater, glacial fluvial is kind of think of generic outwash meltwaters. That's going to start to sort out the different size particles. So you'll have sands and gravels in one spot and clays and sands in another. Alluvium is a modern day water sorted materials. So rivers and things. You can see most of that dark blue is along the Connecticut River Valley on the east side of the state. Glaciolacustrine is from all those glacial lakes that existed when the ice was damming up areas and sea level was higher. We actually had glacial lakes, and we even had some glacial marine soils developed, soils that still have salts from when it was an old seaway. Most of those are hard to see on this map, but most of the ones that I identified in this map ended up in the islands up in Lake Champlain. So we've got those different sets of water sorted ones. You can see some of the dark ones are areas of a lot of just decomposed plant material. Think of really large wetlands, bogs, places where vegetation has died out and just built up over time, and it's so wet there's no oxygen in there to break it down. And then there's kind of a big chunk of this other. And that would be anything we include in our soil survey that's not officially soil, but so it doesn't have a parent material, but we still map it. You can see most of it's Lake Champlain, but some of it would be areas where we had denied access. So you might notice like a military base or something like that. We don't have a map, it just shows up as that other category. Okay, topography. That's another one people sometimes have trouble with wrapping their head around because we're talking about the relief of the landscape. So we're looking at how steep or how flat the landscape is. Flatter, stable surfaces are going to allow soil development to happen more. If they're really steep, then water and soil is eroding constantly, and it's having to restart its geological clock in developing that soil horizon. Another thing, if I'm on the base of a slope where stuff is accumulating, I'm going to have a different soil develop. This diagram is really nice. It was made with some LIDAR hillside data, and I talked with Roger Duquette because he actually is the one who made this. It's from over in the White Mountains on the survey they're working on right now, but it combines, you can see the parent material on the bottom with some of the topographical relief and all of the soils and how they occur. So this is a really nice diagram. It's from an old soils planner. I put a link in the slide here to how you can find all these archived soils planners. They have a lot of good information in them. So then the fifth factor is time. And that's basically how long have all of these factors and all those four soil forming processes had time to work and develop those soils. In Vermont, all of our soils are really only about 10,000 years old at the oldest. You know, some surfaces would even be considered younger. Think of a new floodplain or a landslide that starts over your geologic clock. So we don't have time for a lot of development of soil horizons. We don't see a lot of really extreme differences developing in our soils from soil processes. If we have a big contrast of material on the top versus the bottom, that's usually because of the type of parent material. It's not because we've had so much soil development that we've had an increase in clay accumulating in the subsoil just because of soil processes. So we combine all those things together, all those 5 soil forming factors, and we get what we consider a soil series. And this is another photo from a soils planner that Tom Villers took, retired resource soil scientist, of the Tunbridge, Vermont state soil. So it's got from that forested vegetation, beautiful organic surface horizon, that really bleached, leached out layer beneath it, and then the unaltered, relatively unaltered till underneath that on top of some bedrock. And when I first started dating a guy from Vermont, I of course had to look up their state soil. And I found this really great descriptor of it when they designated it officially as the state soil. This professor at UVM, Richard Bartlett, says, "It's the soil that makes Vermont hills greener than those in either New Hampshire or New York." So I just thought, well, that's kind of a fun, proud way to highlight your state soil. So how do we study soils? Some soil scientists work in a laboratory. Some soil scientists are really looking at the components. With NRCS and soil survey, we are studying how they occur in the landscape. And this is part of the fun that I really have enjoyed. Soils, you can see this is from the old archived published soil survey of Chittenden County, and it has what we call block diagrams that are a lot like that diagram Roger Duquette made of the White Mountains that has the LIDAR hillshade and the soil is designated. This one was actually drawn by hand. So, some soil surveys have better diagrams if you had better artists working on that survey. But they're really cool information, and they talk about how we go about and study and make those. I just want to do a little throwback. There's even this archived version from 1904. There was a soil survey done in the Vergennes area, Vermont, New York. And this was before the 5 soil forming factors was even fully designated as the official way to map soils. But it's just, there's a lot of really interesting information in some of these old surveys identifying things. And it's interesting to see what kinds of stuff they keyed in on at different times of the science when we knew what we knew. One of the things I really like about this one is they describe the Vergennes black clay as being very tenacious and sticky when wet. We don't write things like we used to. We don't describe soils. Tenacious is not a technical term, I don't think. I haven't seen it in any of our current manuals, but man, would it be fun if we could do some more descriptive things like that. So I always think of the tenacious Vergennes clays. All right, but how do we make those maps? How do we study them? Traditionally, we look out at the landscape and we use those 5 soil forming factors to kind of draw some different lines. And I have to apologize, this slide is from Utah. I haven't had a chance to make one for Vermont, but it's got some nice designations drawn on it. You can see where they've drawn out lines based on the different vegetation, right? Soil forming factor, those organisms. You can see that some areas are flatter and steeper than other ones, and they've drawn those out. So historically, going out in the landscape, we're going out there, and I do this in my head all the time, driving around out in the field. I'm drawing lines around where the 5 soil forming factors differ that I can tell just based on the landscape. And then we go out and we dig some holes. So there's different types of data we collect. We have 10-hole transects where you walk all the way across a unit and you dig 10 observation holes and do 10 soil profiles. And that's how we determine our composition, because that soil isn't going to be exactly the same in that unit. It's going to vary. So it might be 30% soil type A and 70% soil type B. And that's how we come up with those percentages. If we're covering a lot of area, once we have a really good model down, we'll do things like traverses, where we'll go out, we don't do like a 10-hole transect to do proportions. We'll go ahead and just identify components of the landscape to verify that that's the soil we expect to find in that component of the landscape. So you can see this traverse has gone kind of walking across different map units, and we might do a traverse just to confirm that that is the map unit we anticipate should be there. And then I have this other one that just says field observations. Sometimes when we're mapping, we don't even dig a hole. Sometimes we have a really strong correlation to the vegetation, the site, the location. All of that information goes into soil surveys too. So a field observation may just be going out, verifying the slope that exists or verifying the species that are growing there. Once we do that, we take all that data back together and we come up with our soil map unit. We give it a symbol, and that is traditionally how soil surveys were done for over 100 years. But how do we do soil surveys now? We are in the realm of digital soil mapping these days, and I'm not going to get into the weeds on this too much because there are some really great webinars that are done by some other NRCS folks on digital soil mapping. And this is where we're taking point data, or training data, those soil profiles, soil properties. We're taking a lot of remote sense data. So whether it's aerial photography, whether it's elevation data, we call those covariates. It goes into a predictive computer model, and then it spits out a soil map. And the soil map that's generated by digital soil mapping is very different than a traditional soil map. Instead of these polygons that exist over the landscape, we end up with these pixels that have specific locations and specific soil data. Now that soil data may not be this soil series exists here. It may be this is this depth to bedrock, or this has this percent clay. The digital soil maps are geared a lot more towards properties, but they can also be surveys series. It just depends on the ability of the model to develop that kind of a map. And in fact, one of the very first digital soil surveys was done in Essex County, Vermont. They were working on choosing different types of covariants for pedological knowledge. You know, which ones are we going to use? Relative position in the landscape versus wetness indexes and things like that. It depends on what is an influence to pedologic development. If I'm in a very flat area, elevation data probably isn't that important for me because the soil's not going to change a lot because the elevation isn't changing very much. But if I'm in a place where I have very obvious species differences, say conifers versus hardwoods that really correlate with different soil types, I might be able to use vegetation data really critically. So Jessica Phillip in our St. Johnsbury office has a webinar all about the digital soil mapping they did in Essex County and how they created that map. And some of the layers they found that were really useful were slope and wetness index. But even with digital soil mapping, we still have to go out and dig a bunch of holes. We may not be doing it in transects. We may not be doing it in exactly field observations or traverses the way we used to do them. Now they're points that we kind of pull out from the model to identify areas where we need to collect some more information. And these photos are of the other soil scientist in our office, Devin Brody, collecting soil data to assist in an update for the Lake Champlain Basin Clays project. So now we've talked a little bit about soils and how we study it and NRCS, how it exists in the landscape. We're going to dive a little bit into soil health, since that's the really, really big topic of the day with soils, and how we promote soil health. How do we build soil health? So back to the beginning, we kind of have what was soil in and of itself: physical stability, support, water infiltration ability, it provides nutrients to plants. Soil health is the continued capacity of the soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. I can dig up a bunch of sand or a bunch of gravel and use it in a hydroponic system, but we don't consider that soil. It's not this inherent living, breathing skin of the earth. It's just a medium for plant growth at that point. And the way we treat our soils out on the landscape, sometimes we're treating them like a hydroponic system. We're not using any of its natural ability to function as this ecosystem that can provide all those features to us. We're just using it as a growth medium. So having a healthy soil is one that has that inherent continued capacity versus an unhealthy soil where we have to put a lot of things into it so that it can still provide the functions it needs. So this is a diagram that's been passed around to a few people and modified a few times, and I've put my own spin on it. Going back to those 5 soil forming factors that create our current soil, and then we manage it somehow. Maybe we farm it, maybe it's in trees, maybe we harvest things off of it, maybe we burn. Whenever we're doing management, we're changing the organisms that are related to that soil. We're changing that biological component to it. And how we change that is what's going to impact our soil health in that soil. So a big thing here, soil health is all about biology. Now, some of you are probably looking at these pictures and that doesn't look like Vermont. And they're not from Vermont. They're from when I was working in Utah out in the desert. But I always want to bring these pictures up because when we talk about soil health, we're usually talking in an agricultural environment. And so we're talking about very specific characteristics we expect the soil to have or are looking for that should be better or worse. And then we think about desert soils or soils in other locations that don't inherently look like that, and sometimes we think they must not be very healthy. When in fact, some of these soils are some of the healthiest in the world because they have this amazing capacity to continue to function in their natural environment, providing for all of these different ecosystems that exist. So when we're talking about soil health, remember there's always the context of what is the continued capacity you need it to function as an ecosystem, as an agricultural system. How we manage both of those different ecosystems is going to be different because we're trying to get different functions out of them. So this is classic soil food web diagram. Soil health and managing for biology is nothing new. You guys have probably seen this before, but I always like to zoom in on it and draw a bunch of extra arrows, because all those orange arrows in the original, they just flow away, right? They flow from the plants to the organic matter, and then everything flows away from the organic matter. But all of these things help feed that organic matter. And soil health is all about utilizing the full food web to build that organic matter so that the soil can function as an ecosystem. These are some screenshots from a video that's narrated by a retired NRCS, Ray Archuleta. And they're microscopic videos, and you can actually see like the microbes swimming around in the goo on the video. And he's talking about how the plant is releasing sugars into this liquid that the microbes are swimming around in. So the sugars, that liquid, that's food. They're feeding the microbes, and the microbes are in turn feeding the plant. But unless you have the plant producing all of this sugar feeding the microbes, it doesn't exist. You need to have the plant there to start this ecosystem going. The microbes on their own don't have any food to feed on. And one of the things to key in on is, what is sugar? It's a carbohydrate. Carbohydrates are made of a lot of carbon. When we think of organic matter in the soil, we usually think of what's on the left. Leaf litter, peat, humus, broken down, dead materials, compost, manure, other things we incorporate, amendments with tillage. But 50 to 20% of the organic carbon in undisturbed soils is this glomalin molecule that the photo on the right is depicting. They used a special laboratory procedure to make it glow a fluorescent green, because it's usually a brown molecule. You can't really distinguish it very well from other soil particles or other soil organic matter. But using this fluorescence, you can really see how much it is completely coating the soil aggregates. Glomalin, that diagram is from a published document by Chris Nichols of ARS Research Laboratory. And glomalin is produced by arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi that have a symbiotic relationship with plants. The plant, again, it's providing sugars to the fungi. The fungi are going out and grabbing other nutrients from the soil and bringing it to the plant, bringing water to the plant. They really extend the rooting system tremendously. And so her document talks about how these hyphae are coated in glomalin, and periodically it sloughs off, either when the hyphae die or get severed from the plant. They also, tends to coat the aggregates. And this glomalin is a protective coating, right? Because if we've got these hyphae taking water and nutrients to the plant and carbohydrates from the plant, we don't want that just leaving the hyphae in the middle of the soil. We don't needs to be protected from other things infecting the hyphae and things like that. So it has a purpose. It's not just there to build soil stability. It's just a fantastic side effect of it. So how do we build things like glomalin, which is predominantly carbon, which is produced, these microbial communities that need carbon from the plant because that's their food source? This slide is from a presentation by Dr. Don Rajkowski, retired ARS researcher. And he was one of the first people to identify the loss of carbon in the soil with the introduction of tillage. So he's a big advocate for soil health management as carbon management. You need to take practices that are going to reduce carbon loss and combine them with practices that are going to maximize carbon input to the soil. And doing that, it's all about biology. It's all about having things planted and not disturbing them. So minimizing tillage and maximizing the input with things growing as much as possible, cover crops, diverse crops, more growth throughout the season. I asked him, he was in Utah doing some presentations, and I was basically his chauffeur across the state for our soil health workshops. And I asked him one of those car rides how he discovered that tillage resulted in this tremendous loss of carbon dioxide from the soil, because he was like the person who discovered it. And he kind of lit up, and he's just like, it was a complete accident. They weren't looking at soil carbon at all. They were looking at plant respiration. And they had this special device they put on top of plants, on top of the soil, that would measure how much carbon dioxide the plant was giving off. And part of the process for doing these studies is you would place it on ground that didn't have a plant on it to zero it out, just like tearing the weight on a scale, and then you put it over the plant. And his technician was out there one day, and he could not get the thing to zero out. It would not work. So he goes out, and they're trying to figure out what's going on. What could be happening? Is there something with the instrument? Is that something, with the traffic of vehicles driving by? Is it, exhaust from this tractor that's plowing the field nearby? And then they were like, wait, this is only a problem on freshly tilled ground. So that's how they accidentally discovered all of this carbon dioxide that was being released from tillage. Total just stumbled upon this thing when their other experimental study was having difficulties. So it's really incredible how science works sometimes. So this is a video that, if you ever seen a presentation by Jay Fuhrer, he's one of our NRCS retired now soil health specialists in North Dakota. He includes this in a lot of his talks, and it's only a few minutes, and it's a simulation of a year in the life of Earth's carbon dioxide, and it starts January 1 of 2006 and goes all the way to the end of the year. And it's a model of simulation, but it is based on real data. They do use real carbon dioxide sensor data throughout the video. And you can kind of see these are just some screenshots from some of the months. The red is very, very high carbon dioxide levels. As you go down kind of the rainbow to blue, it's very, very low. And then when it's like see-through, there's next to nothing, or the lowest levels of carbon dioxide. And he brings up this video, not for the doom and gloom climate change, because that's what I always think of when people talk about global carbon dioxide, right? He shows it and discusses the cyclical nature of the carbon cycle and how, January, it's relatively low, it's building over the winter, you can see more in March, and then it just has gone nuts in May. June, it starts to decrease. July, August, it's almost hardly any there. Even into September and even October, it starts to pick up a little bit more, and then it's picking up in November. And he's talking about the cycle of our vegetation. Most of the land mass is in the Northern Hemisphere. So that's where most of our vegetation is, but it's also where most of our industrial and carbon dioxide output is. So the cycle is fitting the seasons for the Northern Hemisphere growth cycle. And what's going on in May, when things are starting to green up, they're also doing spring tillage. So you think about all of the spring tillage that's happening across the northern hemisphere, the massive amount of carbon dioxide that is dumping in the atmosphere before the plants have had a chance to really come up and take all that in. And then you look and see what happens when those plants do come up, June, July, and August, how all those plants that are now, living and photosynthesizing that carbon dioxide into sugar, how much they're able to suck out. So I continue to show this video, not for the doom and gloom climate science, but just look at the ability to capture carbon dioxide, all that stuff that's come out and gone into the soil. It's just really impressive. So when we're thinking about managing for soil health, managing for carbon. Soil health planning principles, I'm sure you all have seen these before. Disturb it little, increase diversity, living roots in the soil, keep it covered. I always throw the fifth one in there because I was trained in the West, and incorporating livestock is something they've seen a lot of benefit from, even though I know it's a little more controversial out east. Just like to make people aware. Whole goal is to create habitat for that soil food web to build organic matter. And remember, managing for soil health is nothing new. What is new is the science of how and why it works. Glomalin was first identified in the 1990s. This guy's, knocking down a green manure crop, which sure sounds like a clover crop to me. And I don't know, maybe that's the 1990s. I'm guessing it was older than that. This was an undated publication from when I worked in Montana. They've cleaned out the state office in Vermont, so I can't rummage around through nearly as many old materials, but it sounds like a fad sometimes, but it's really not. It's just good management. We've been doing soil health management for a long time. So some next steps. For those of you who are really into the science, and I know in Vermont we're really into like ecosystem services and things, I happened to catch some presentations this summer of some research that they're doing and looking at soil health assessments, how we're advancing them, how we're incorporating that management human factor with all those soil forming factors, because soil health is going to look different in different types of soils that form in different environments. They're doing a lot of soil health assessments in Vermont, and they're actually building this continuum of soil health across different management structures. So if you have a chance, these videos are only about 20 minutes long, I highly recommend taking a look at it. It is a lot more scientific, it's a lot more in the weeds, but if you're interested on, what are the potentials for these soil health indicators and assessments, and what's our optimal management if we're looking for a healthy soil, that they're really worth watching and figuring out what they're doing over there, see what we could do here. There's a couple of more on the collection and analysis of Missouri dynamic soil property data. They're talking about these biological soil properties in Missouri that they've looked at. And a new a new NRCS state soil health specialist in Illinois, Stacy Zuber, she got her PhD looking at soil health indicators, and she looked at 5,300 samples of fields that were cover cropped by farmers in Missouri. So they're really starting to throw this big net to look at the indicators, the soil properties across different management and different soils to start to give us that whole scale picture of, all right, well, what are we aiming for? What does this do? What properties are changing? And it's just some interesting science I wanted to recommend to people. And since it is World Soil Day, I have to share my favorite article. If you guys want to know a bit about the heart of soil scientists, you can find this one. There's a Northeast Soils Association that has it on their website. But Hans Jenny is actually the guy famed with coining the 5 soil forming factors. And he talks about, how to him soils are beautiful. And I think a lot of soil scientists feel that way. And people look at us like we're crazy, even though we get December 5th to not be crazy people and to celebrate them. So I just wanted to point that out. He talks about seeing beautiful depictions of soils in artwork. And I was at Shelburne Museum over the winter, and look at that. There's beautiful soil profile painted on canvas. And granted, this is only like this infinitesimally small corner of this much larger painting that's a view of West Point by Thomas Chambers. But look, you can see the beautiful brown surface soil. There's all this, layers of things leaching down. Anyway, list of different resources and things I've put in there. And we've got a few minutes if anybody has any questions.
Thank you so much, Meredith. That was very fascinating. Folks, please feel free to unmute and ask your questions.
Hi, this is Amir, engineer from Ag Agency. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Amir. Sorry.
So on one of the maps in the beginning of presentation on soils in Vermont, I saw a large patch of soil marked as organic soil or organic material in region of Addison County and Rutland.
Mm-hmm.
So do we have
Yes.
explanation for that, where it came from?
I don't have it easily on hand right now, but looking at the map, I can see it's going along a river. There's some blue mixed in there, so I know that that's alluvial soils following a river system. It would take me some time to drill down into the map. I don't have any more detail than what that is right here, but they're going to be wetland soils, mucky, peaty, organic material. And this is a really coarse, approximation of the soils in the area. So it's not, it's a representation. It's not exactly 100%.
And the DEC wetland specialists are chiming in that that's Otter Creek, huge wetland complex of 15,000 acres.
Awesome. Great.
Right.
Thank
Nice.
you.
Thank you.
So Amy asks, Meredith, which soil type is your favorite aesthetically?
It's going to be whichever one I get to dig a hole in, Amy. I mean, come on, obviously, that's how that has to go, right? I once had an interview. They asked me what my favorite soil property was. and right off the bat, and this was for a job, right off the bat, I was like, well, color, because people think it's brown, and it's not just brown, it's all different colors. But then I was like, but I also like texture, because you really get to get in there and feel it. And then it was like in structure because of the different shapes. So I'm really bad at favorites.
So Meredith, I would invite you down to dig holes for cultural resources in Addison County clay anytime you want.
Hey, I think both me and Devin are happy to come dig in that Addison County clay anytime. Those tenacious clays. Remember, that's the 1904 technical terminology.
Right. Thanks, Meredith.
What are all the, in the map there, the soil parent materials? What are all the others in like kind of that northwest corner there? I guess there'd probably be like cold hollows.
Yeah, well, I mean, so some of them are going to be water, which is why I went ahead and colored it blue, because then the lake would come out blue. They could be areas that are just pure bedrock. They could be areas that, like I said, are denied access mapping. So this might be like the Ethan Allen Range, possibly. They might be areas that are quarries or were mines. They could be areas that we just don't have a lot of data that we populate. So if it's something that sometimes in alluvial systems and river systems, if it's like a gravel bar that is just constantly washing, we a lot of times just slap a name on that and don't fill out all the different data in the database just because of workload. So those might be things that don't come out as a soil parent material because we just haven't put anything in there, and that's why it would come out as other. Some other miscellaneous areas, things like beaches, things like that. But yeah, there is a fair amount that comes out, and it's just what was the majority for a map unit. So it's probably a lot of rock outcrop.
So we have a question from Reed Sims. He asks, Meredith, have you found similarities among soils with similar 5 soil forming factors in different places? I learned wetland soil functions in Olympia, Washington, and was astounded that all of these principles applied for my work in the Pacific tropical islands.
Yeah, actually that's been one of the really interesting things traveling across the country. I'm originally from Missouri, which is half glaciated, half not. And I started with the agency in Iowa, so not very far away, similar soils, but not exactly the same. And then went to Minnesota and Montana. Now, when I moved to Montana, the precipitation was drastically different, but I was still in a glaciated area. So it was really incredible, some of the things that were similar about the soils in Montana, even with such a stark precipitation difference that related to my Midwestern experience. And then I went to Utah where hardly anything was glaciated and it was like a fish out of water, trying to figure out some of those soils. So yeah, it's really incredible when you can have those 5 soil forming factors and move across the country, and suddenly you're like, oh, you know what? I'm on a foot slope. It doesn't really matter if I'm on a foot slope in Utah or a foot slope in Vermont. That base of the slope is always going to be collecting a little bit more organic material, a little more surface soil that's eroded to that landscape position than other places.
We have another question from Andrew Milliken. He asks, what are the most important changes in management we can take in Vermont to both sequester carbon in soils and improve water quality while maintaining agricultural uses, potentially including use of livestock?
So the most important change, I would say, but I'm a generalist. I'm a jack of all trades, so I'm not a specialist in specifically that arena. But the biggest thing I would recommend is observing your soil and your vegetation and seeing how it's behaving. Because if I incorporate livestock, that can bring in some benefits. But if I pulverize my pasture with them, that takes away any of the benefits I might have gained. I could do cover crops, and that's good. But if I've got a grass system because I'm growing corn and I'm continuing to grow, rye, that's corn, that's grass, I end up seeing nitrogen deficiencies. So the single thing would be to pay attention to what your field, your landscape is doing. Because if we stop and we really take a look at it, we really pay attention to it, that's when we see what it needs. But every field is going to need something different, and every field is going to respond differently to different things. So that's the single most important thing to change. And I'm not saying that people aren't paying attention now, but that would be what I would focus in on the most.
Any other questions for Meredith? We have a comment. Amy says, that was so interesting. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and enthusiasm, and long live the soil. I agree, Amy. Thank you so much, Meredith. That was fascinating, and it was really great to take the time for a deep dive into soils and celebrate them. Do you have a slide with your contact information?
I do not.
Okay, no, that's fine. Well, I will try to include that in the next newsletter listserv that I'm going to be sending out with the recording. So Meredith, I'm sure it's okay if people have further questions, they can direct them to you.
Yes.
Great.
Yes. So my name, it's just my email is meredith.albers@usda.gov. So that would be easiest. I'm currently on detail right now. Oh, I just found the menu for where the controls are for Zoom are. I haven't been able to see it. It popped up in a different spot. Sorry.
You did great. Not knowing where the thing was. Okay. Well, thank you. I want to plug the next webinar coming up, which is January 6th. Oh, that looks backwards. Well, sometimes I have trouble pronouncing certain things. So 1/6. We are going to welcome Obi and Marley. They're going to talk about the success of the original Lake Champlain RCPP project and plans for renewing for the next 5 years. They were awarded $10 million more, and it's going to look really different than the first one. So I hope that you all are able to join us for that. And thank you for today, and we hope to see you in the future. Take care.